Okay, welcome to an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to James Harpur. James is an award-winning poet who has had 6 poetry collections published by Carcanet and Anvil Press. He is also a member of Aosdana, the Irish Academy of Arts. The awards he has won include the Vincent Buckley Prize, a Patrick and Katherine Kavanagh Fellowship, and the UK National Poetry Competition. His work has appeared in the national press, including the Irish Times, the Spectator, the Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Independent. His books include The White Silhouette, an Irish Times Book of the Year, Angels and Harvesters, which was a PBS recommendation and shortlisted for the 2013 Irish Times, and The Dark Age, which won the Michael Hartnett Poetry Prize, and also the book we're going to talk about today, which is The Examined Life. So welcome, James.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you here.
Thank you very much indeed. Great to be here. And I'm looking forward to chatting over our respective experiences of boarding school. Yeah. And I gather that our schools weren't too far apart geographically, but they were in terms of era. I was the 70s border. I think you were 80s, weren't you?
80s, yeah. 86 is when I left 93.
Okay.
Seems quite not long ago, but it's 30 years already. So.
No, exactly. I know. Well, memory is a strange thing, and I'd like to start off actually by talking about it. I should say that when I started writing my book, The Examined Life, it was way back in 2012, and it wasn't intended as an expose of boarding schools or my school, but it was really, I see it or saw it as a record of my tribe, which I don't think had been done or hasn't been done before in verse, thoroughly anyway. And certainly poets until the Renaissance often had the role of being storytellers of their tribe, the keepers of the collective memory. And like it or not, I was part of the boarding school tribe, and I wanted to, I suppose, just represent it using the best words in the best order, to quote Coleridge's definition of poetry. And it dawned on me that those 5 years from 1970 to 75 were easily the most intense and memorable years of my life. I mean, consecutive years. Maybe it's because they marked, the crucial years of teenage development. And anyway, in 2012, it was a long, hot summer here in Ireland, where I live. And I was sort of idly recalling some trivial incident from school decades ago. And I was wondering why the smallest details seemed to stick in my memory. And in particular, I could remember a certain boy's comical French accent in the French class. He kind of spoke it in a French accent with a strange lilt to it. So instead of, mon petit ami, my little friend, it was mon petit ami. And he didn't do it to wind up the teacher or to make us laugh, but it was just one of his idiosyncrasies. And I couldn't think why I couldn't get his accent out of my head. And it seemed to be more tenacious than big life events like my first ever kiss or the elegy at my mum's funeral. And I had this sudden fear that, my last memory on earth would be mon petit ami or something similar. And I thought, well, what is it about those boarding school years that imprinted themselves so deeply and with such triviality. And I think I came to the conclusion that for 5 years I was on fight or flight mode without realizing it. And I think it's the same way that they say that soldiers on campaign are supposed to be able to see every twitch of every bush in case there's a danger lurking in it. I think the same thing happened at boarding school, that you're always on some sort of alert from some imagined or real danger, big or small. And I think that's why the memories of almost everything impress themselves on me. So I began to write down some of these silly things, and then some of the big things emerged. It was a bit like an avalanche. And after a while, I had about 66 draft poems, and I began to shape them into a sort of odyssey, the journey of a 13-year-old sailing off on a voyage to adulthood and encountering all sorts of dangers and adventures. I actually studied Homer's Odyssey at A-level, and so it made sense for me to have a sort of a parallel narrative with my own. So my book has sort of quite a few allusions to the Odyssey. So that's the long and short of it, Piers. That's how I started my book.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, when reading through your poem, I love your references to the Odyssey.
Good.
I think, yeah, there's something, certain of the analogies really link in to the, I'm hearing a bit of feedback on your side. So maybe if I don't speak too much, but so I really love that, bringing in those archetypal figures really, because it was like, yeah, could really feel that journey.
Good.
So thank you. One of the things we're going to do today is just go through, and I'd love you to read some of your poems and then we can talk around those. So one of the first topics is, why boarding school?
Yes, why boarding school? There seems to be, crudely put, there are sort of two archetypes of boarding school. There's the Victorian Tom Brown school days type of classics, cold showers, cricket and flashmen. And then there's the sort of counter model, which is the J.K. Rowling Hogwarts model, which is all magic, mystery, corridors, coziness, and midnight feasts. And my school was moving from one model to the other, very broadly put. And my parents didn't know that really. They, strangely, they sent me to school because I think, like a lot of parents, they thought it was character forming. And I guess they believed that a private education was more thorough and educative than the current state school system at the time. But more than that, they strangely had positive boarding experiences themselves. I say strangely, partly for the obvious reason, partly because they were boarding in the 1930s, which wasn't known for its sort of liberal and tender views on education. But my dad, who was Irish, was sent off to Northern Ireland to a school which he didn't seem to say a bad word about in later life, and became the sort of representative of the school in London. And my mum, who grew up in Paris, she was British, but the daughter of emigres, she was sent off to a boarding school in Saffron Walden when she was about 16, and it was a Quaker school. And she seems to have liked it very much. We actually have her letters from school, saying what a lovely time she was having. And because she was sort of Frenchified and spoke English with a French accent, she was a bit of a novelty. And I think, made a lot of friends. And maybe because it was a Quaker school, it was much more kindly and gentle. I don't know. But certainly they didn't have such a terrible experience that they thought, oh gosh, we're never going to send our kids to boarding school. Nevertheless, despite all these positive things in my background about school, I still remember the fateful afternoon, as I'm sure every boarder does, when your parents or your father or mother take you off. And I'd like to read a poem, if I may, Piers, called Separation, which tries to record that moment, which I'd been, I suppose, rehearsing for about a year. I had two brothers who had gone to the same school before me, so I kind of knew a bit about what was going to happen, but nothing prepares you for it. And it was slightly unreal, actually driving in the car to school, knowing that my life was going to change irrevocably and radically within a few hours. It's a strange feeling. So I tried to capture the sort of unreality of the situation in the poem with my father driving. So I'll read the poem. It goes like this: Separation. It's like a Sunday outing to the Downs. A batsman's strolling out on Shamley Green, as if he thinks the summer has no end. But then the road begins to twist like a gut, and the last bend flips us into autumn. Across a ridge, the school stretches the sunset, like the thin red line at Balaclava. We drive in silence through the iron gates and park, get out, as calm as undertakers. I can't believe the journey's at an end, but just starting. A bell rings like fate. We stand talking like friends of friends, and Dad recites the pep talk he's rehearsed. My ears can hardly bear each kindly phrase. My eyes are turning to my bedroom posters, and I wonder what my mum is doing now. Shelling peas while watching songs of praise. I get a hug from Dad and watch him go. He drives off with a grin that's not his own and takes my childhood home.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, James. Yeah, those last three lines, that really hits me. I get a hug from Dad and watch him go. He drives off with a grin that's not his own and takes my childhood home.
I expect you had something similar, Piers.
Yeah, as I was sharing on another podcast maybe a few months ago, it might have been with Joy Chevron. And just this sense that the first 3 weeks, I had a bit of an arduous time at home. My father was ex-boarder. I didn't get on with him. That first day was like, I couldn't wait for them to go. It was like, yes, so, but I realize now that they took my childhood home, and I didn't realize it at the time. I think it was only after 3 weeks that suddenly it was like, oh, what have I done now? I've agreed to come here. But I hear so many people talk about that first, it seems to be the separation, whether it's at 6 years old, 8 years old, or at 11 or 13, that sense of there's that transition, something's happened, and they can't put words to it. Something's happened, and you really, yeah, it's really clear with those words. So how did that feel?
Well, I think, I mean, as I record it, the first night and the first few days and the first few weeks, it was like jumping into an icy sea, and suddenly you get that sort of shock of your breath being suspended. Because I think no matter how much you try to imagine the ramifications of boarding school life, you cannot quite imagine it all until you're actually there. And I found that after the initial shock, the first night in the dormitory, which was, again, you imagine it, you think, well, what's it like? What would it be like to share a large room with 25 strangers, some of whom might be really unpleasant or not, After the shock, I think there was, for me, bewilderment. There were just hundreds of things to remember to do. Like in my case, not walking on the south field. Make sure not putting your hands in your pockets when passing a prefect. How did you know which one was a prefect? Where were the classrooms? What time in the morning did you have to get up in order to serve food to the rest of the table? It was relentless. And you were told that, quite quickly you'd be punished if you did walk on the south field or had your tie undone slightly. So right from the start, there was, shock, bewilderment, disorientation. And I think this led to anxiety, for, obvious reasons. And I think at this stage, it's only natural that you reach out for something that's solid and stable, a memory of stability, of warmth and stability. And that, in my case, that was obviously home. I mean, it probably wasn't for you if you were having argy-bargy with your parents at this stage. But for me, my parents were very loving. And my siblings were lovely too. And of course, then you get the whole syndrome of homesickness after the shock. And in conjunction with this, I thought I might read a poem about homesickness.
Please do. That would be.
And because homesickness was kind of like a dreaded condition. Because if you were seen to be homesick, it meant you were vulnerable. And if you were vulnerable, you were like a pigeon with a broken wing. And we all know what happens to pigeons with broken wings. And we had a payphone. We had one payphone for 500 boys. And you might think on payphone with 500 boys that there'd be a queue around the corner. And blow me, for 5 years, I hardly saw anyone use it, because the law of the school was that if you used a payphone, it meant you were homesick. And if you're homesick, then, well, I've just said what the consequences of that was. However, in my first few weeks at school, I noticed some poor little lad, little guy, I don't know who he was, used to sneak out to the payphone, which was in the sort of quadrangle, at night. And he'd be there ringing, presumably ringing home. And it was painful because I knew what was going to happen. So I've called this the payphone trap, this poem. It's quite short. It's a sonnet, in fact, 14 lines. Lit up at night, it lured you to the surface, a fishing lamp mimicking the moon. its hook baited with your mother's voice, could spin you to a world you had erased to keep your mind in safe oblivion. I watched a new boy squirm on it for days, his face ghoul lit behind the quad's grey glass, gulping at the familiar. And soon his parents turned up from his nursery past, removed him smoothly as an ambulance. And me? 5 years I never touched that phone, but I'd picture hours ringing in the house, my mother rushing in to answer it, me hanging up before it was too late.
Thank you, James. It's interesting, as I read each of your poems, it's interesting as I speak, I hear a reflection on, kind of a reverb on your end. So it sounds like I have some Darth Vader person speaking back to me. So as I was reading your poems, it was like I've read literally dozens of books about trauma and different things. And yet the specifics you use in the poems is beautiful. And I haven't read this anywhere else. The payphone. It's like, yeah, of course. We had one at the bottom of the stairs. So 50 to 60 boys would walk past this payphone. And again, you knew who was crying, because the voice would carry all the way up the steps and into the dormitory.
Oh dear, yes.
There was no privacy. I think maybe later on they moved it so it was a separate room, but you could still look in. It wasn't as if it was, but you couldn't therefore hear what they were saying. But I can really resonate with that. So
the phone had the same stigma at your school.
Yeah. And you tried not to use it, and you could, the boys who were really badly bullied, they were the ones who were using it the most. It was like you say, it's a trap. Stop using the phone.
Yeah.
When you become, disassociated. Judith Herman talks about that with trauma. We learn to disassociate. And therefore, those people who were being bullied at my school, when they stopped, they became dissociated, they disconnected from their emotion, they stopped using the phone.
Right, yeah.
Don't need mummy anymore.
No. Yeah.
And I find it fascinating. 5 years, I never touched that phone.
Yeah.
That's like, wow. Wow. So, yeah, thank you. I think it's really powerful to have these specific stories, these specific, because as you're reading, I can feel my emotions of that memory of the phone there. You could hear it ringing as well when someone was calling in.
Yeah.
Like the ghoulish, oh no, someone's calling. Who is it? So, and interesting, in the senior house, from 14 to 18, I don't think I ever saw anyone use it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a trap.
Yeah.
False friend.
Yeah. So, so I realized that time's going to go very fast. So, and we've got quite a few different subjects to talk about. So I'd love you to go on to just speak a little bit about your family situation and how that affected you.
Yeah. Well, basically, my parents were splitting up just as I was going off to school. And I think my father probably was waiting for me to go off to school before he made his move. With the best of intentions, really. I think he was sort of thinking that that it was an appropriate time for me like a rite of passage for me, that I wouldn't miss him so much because I was sort of doing my own thing. But either way, it was very tough on my mother, who was very distraught about him moving out. He went off to London and fetched up with another woman. But what was interesting for me in retrospect was that at the time I was so busy trying to cope with school that I didn't really, I suppose, appreciate, certainly not my mother's condition. But also, as time went past, it changed the dynamic between my school and home life. That is to say, when I used to go back on exeat or holidays when I was older, home was quite a sad place, because it would just be my mum in quite a big house. My siblings had left, and she was there by herself, you know, not very happy. And, and it was, you know, quite quiet and cold and grey. And whereas school was, for all its challenges, you know, was full of life. It was full of, you know, shouting and music coming out of studies and energy, and laughter. And, you know, it became almost a proper in loco parentis, a substitute for parents or for the family home. So it was strange how that dynamic changed. You know, for the first 2 years, certainly I couldn't wait to get home, you know, and just be in, just to be in a room without 25 other people crowding into it. You know, I thought, oh my God, how would I survive? But in the end, it was almost vice versa. And there's a poem which I won't read, but towards the end, where I got sick and had to come home for a whole term. And I suddenly got all these letters from schoolmates, and it was probably an exercise in class, you know, please write to poor old Harper. But they were quite tender, and they all had idiosyncratic handwriting. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, I'm school sick. Not homesick, but school sick. And I thought that was a real eye-opener. Anyway, to cut to the chase a bit, this is a poem about when my mum, right at the start of my school career, told me that Dad was off, and she tried to break it in stages, in a very kindly way. And I've called it Telemachus, because Telemachus was the son of Odysseus and Penelope in the Odyssey, and Odysseus goes off to war for 10 years and then spends another 10 years coming back home. So he's like the absent father, which was analogous to my situation. So this is called Telemachus. Not long before the term began, my mum knocked on my door. Can I come in? Her voice still practicing its equilibrium. You know, Dad's been unhappy for a while. I did. He wants to take a break from us. You know he loves you. I nodded, a smile too wide, her eyelids blinking out a code. He's moving out, but only for a bit. He says he'll visit us the odd weekend. And still, I couldn't grasp those eyes, leaking secrets. The tremor in her lip, her lunging hug, all urging me to guess that Dad had long since sailed from Ithaca, and only for a bit would mean forever.
Thank you, James. That last line, and only for a bit would mean forever. Wow.
Yes, it's kind of true emotionally, I think. That was the sort of break of the link with my dad. He did actually come and sort of pop back from time to time over the years, but he'd gone on to another life, really. He was like Odysseus. He'd gone on to other wars and another woman, and he'd left. And my poor old mum, who was trying to soften the blow, I think she was trying to soften it for herself as much as for me. Yeah.
I love that line as well. Those eyes leaking secrets. Those eyes leaking secrets.
I think as a child, you're kind of semi-aware of adult masks and behavior without actually sort of being conscious of it necessarily at the time, but you just sense something's not quite right. And although mum was going through all the right sort of saying the right words, I kind of knew there was something behind it. But it sounds like a different situation from yours.
Yeah, it was, as you say that, it brings up this memory of while I think I was 16, my parents decided to go through divorce as well. And as you say about leaking secrets, I saw my father cry twice, once on his deathbed, and once when I was 16, 17, he came to me and started to cry and say that he was having a divorce, that my mum had asked him to leave.
Right.
And so that same thing about him sailing, so yeah, so I think it was different, as in it was my choice to go, but actually, I can really relate to those words.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. Later on, you talk in your poems when you're talking about going off to Oxbridge, doing the Oxbridge exam, and your father comes back in for a while. But that touched me as well, because it was like in the poem you say they were acting as if you weren't even there.
Yeah.
It was like, the way our parents,
sort of a commodity.
yeah.
Oxbridge, an Oxbridge. That's right. Oxbridge. I became Oxbridge material, like a bale of wool.
Yeah, I used to talk about the I don't know if it's Angel as well. This idea that you're unpunishable when you got caught smoking. Well, he's Oxbridge, so we just have a little talk to him on his bed. But
yeah.
Everyone else. Did everyone else get expelled from that?
Not that particular incident, but you were more vulnerable if you weren't Oxbridge, because my school so seldom at that stage sent people to Oxbridge that they were like gold dust, and obviously it did the school no harm to get an Oxbridge candidate in. So if you became Oxbridge material, then you had a charmed life. And the incident you're referring to, I was actually on a yellow card, which I didn't mention. I'd got caught smoking in my upper fifth year, with an official letter and a sort of, basically another strike and you're out. So when I got caught again in that, I think it was more or less the last term, I thought, well, this could be the end of my academic life as I knew it. But and then when I got the reprieve, I suddenly realized, oh, they're not throwing me out because I'm Oxbridge material. Partly anyway. It wasn't the whole story. I think they liked me. I mean, I wasn't, they could tell I wasn't a bad apple.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I'd love you to move on to the next kind of chapter, almost question, just about the challenges. What you found the challenges to be of boarding school.
Yeah, I will. I said to you in the preamble that I kind of had everything going for me that you can have when you go to boarding school. I was quite big for my age. I was pretty good at games. I was reasonably bright. And most of all, I had a brother who was a folk hero at school. He was there for my last year. He was a sort of Robin Hood character who made it his life to make mischief whenever he could. And so he was a folk hero among the boys. And whenever anything went wrong, he always got the blame for it, or the kudos. You know, someone put a third hand on the school clock. You know, and my brother John, you know, was got the blame for that, even though he was nowhere near the scene of the crime. But he, if once it got out that I was his brother, then I got a free pass. And one of the poems, which I won't read, but where I get almost sort of roughed up by the two school heavies. Just as I'm about to get it, one of them realizes I'm John Harper's brother, and the fists release and I sneak off, you know, thanking my brother for being my guardian angel. But my biggest challenge was that I was basically very shy, introverted, and very private. And I was in a world that was relentlessly the opposite, public, extroverted. And there was just no escape from groups. And I'm still semi-allergic to groups of all sorts. There, you know, apart from classes, you know, there was chapel, dining hall, changing rooms. And then, of course, you know, when the day boys went home, there were the dormitories, which could be as large as 30 plus. The bathrooms were freestanding baths, so that, you know, if someone came in and felt they wanted to push your head under the water, then that was fair game. The toilets were mostly freestanding wooden cubicles with no ceilings. So if someone wanted to, they could hoist themselves up and watch you as you were engaged on the loo, you know, if you fancied that sort of entertainment. So there was virtually nowhere you could go to be by yourself. And I realized only afterwards that the A-level subjects I chose were probably not because I was interested in the subjects, but because very few people were doing them. With Latin, there was only one other. With Greek, it was just me. And for divinity, there were three others. And it was an extraordinary thing that for 2 years, I had almost private tuition, which was a situation that had never happened before or since. But I think, as I say, at the time, I thought, well, you know, I'm a classicist, but really what I was a survivalist. It was my way of just withdrawing from the school as much as I could. And that was the way I did it. But I suppose the most general challenging thing and the defining difference between boarding and day schools is the dormitory. And the dormitory was as you know, Piers, it was a strange lunar world. And it was like a scene from the Greek underworld, really, with its own atmospheres and laws, and a heightened sense of being vulnerable, of never quite knowing whether there might be a threat or not. And I like, with your permission, to read 2 poems, one set in the middle dormitory, which was the biggest and the scariest in our house, and then an incident in the senior dormitory, which was less scary, but nevertheless open to threats. So they're quite short, so I'll read them in succession, if I may.
Please do, James.
So the first is called Middle Dormitory, Passover. a stationary ghost train. Sometimes a boy might spring up from a nightmare and jabber on, then sink back to his coffin. The flashlight of the duty prefect's torch sucked blood from every face it hit. You'd hear a dreamer's unhinged chuckle, feral snores. Worse was when I saw 4 shades appear and tilt a bed up 90-odd degrees. A boy come mattress crumpled to the floor, his piggy grunts converging to a cry. I panicked, prayed, dear God, not me, please, please, and held my breath, then felt them pass me by, returning to the dark from which they'd crept, the corner of your sleep that never slept.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thanks. So I'll go straight into the second one, which is called Senior Dormitory, Faust. One time, a silhouette materialized from nowhere and sat on Brewer's bed, dead, quiet. His nimble fingers, quick as 2 white mice, flicked lit matches at the pillowed hair, sparking a dread and hope it would ignite. We were transfixed by every little flare's trajectory, the sudden chiaroscuro, as if we'd fallen into Rembrandt's Night Watch. But we did nothing to arrest the shadow, our souls becoming Mephistophelian. We felt our wills dissolve with every match and could not, would not intervene. Not even when a cry roared out like flame above our laughter, though not our whispering shame.
Yeah, powerful, powerful. What that brings up. Thank you. I was talking about that this morning with my therapist about speaking up. I've been writing in my own book my last year at school, watching people being bullied, and yet I did nothing. It was that same thing.
Yeah.
We felt our wills dissolve with every match, and we would not intervene. And I can understand, for me as a young boy, not standing up for those people who are being bullied. But for me as a 17, 18-year-old, you know, one of the boys that I saw being bullied, his window was smashed in. He left the next morning, never came back to the school, and I'd said nothing. And that whispering shame, I feel that too, as I hear you speak those words, that I didn't say anything. I didn't speak up.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, that. It's sort of bullying by proxy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, the payoff of bullying or witnessing is A, it's not you.
Yeah.
And if it's someone else, then you're further down the track. So there are all sorts of, you know, interesting and scary issues of complicitness, you know, which at a greater level surface in, sort of, well, I'm thinking of World War II and, complicitness in not standing up for Jewish neighbor if you're in Warsaw or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, at a micro level, well, boarding schools, as we know, were kind of like micro societies. They were complete societies, really.
Yeah.
And well, yeah, as you say, we both remember our own part in incidents like that. And yeah.
Yeah, it kind of brought it up for me today, my fear of publishing my book, which I see, you've had the courage to speak what you felt. There's part of me that when I think of publishing mine is like that shame that, I can't speak up, but actually I'm not a child anymore. Like you've done, I can share. This is just my experience, so I really, honor that courage. And the Passover one, we used to call that lampposting.
Yeah.
There we go. You're going to have your bed lampposted. It was your birthday. Great. You might even get the surprise of you being in it, like that young, that boy.
Yeah, we call it 90 degrees, but it's, essentially the same thing. And well, the poem says it all, really. I just remember watching it. It was the first time I'd actually witnessed it. And I remember thinking, oh God, they're going to come for me. And I just remember the four of them just like black shadows just passing very silently into the corner of my sleep that never slept. And that's a very common border experience, that, I think, isn't it?
That you mentioned at the beginning, that almost like being on tenterhooks, being at war almost, not really being able to rest, never being able to sleep.
Yes.
So I'd love you to speak. We spoke a bit before we began about the idea of the positive aspects of school, and I feel that's partly, obviously, the work I do is mainly around boarding school syndrome, and I see part of the healing is to find the positive from it. So I'd love you to share a little bit about that, what you found those to be.
Well, as I said, my book wasn't intended to be an expose of the horrors of boarding school. It was just meant to be a warts and all record, a testament to what I went through, in the hope that others would recognize it and get something from it. And there were a lot of positives at my school. I was very lucky. I mean, I say lucky, having heard a bit about your school and having heard a bit, bits from other people's schools, I can see that I was lucky, that my school, there were at least 10 masters who were exceedingly, had an exceedingly good impact on me. And 10 is quite a lot, it's sort of almost, well, I don't know what the percentage is, but, and by which I mean they loved their subjects, they were enthusiastic, they were kind, they were imaginative, they were funny. I remember we had a master called Jeff Bolt, and I remember walking to a pub when I was a senior, and I thought, oh my God, Jeff Bolt's there. I thought, I was on a yellow card. And Jeff Bolt was known to be a bit of an old buffer, kindly and, not really tuned into school life. And he turned around and I thought, well, there's no going back. We stared each other in the face like high noon. And I said, hello, sir. And he said, and I always remember this, he said, I don't know your name, but it's not a good excuse not to buy you a drink. I thought, blimey.
Wow.
I am an Oxbridge angel. But that was Jeff Bolt's way. He was a human being, first of all. and a schoolmaster second. And he just saw an encounter between two people. And, you know, so there were a good number of masters like that. And I want to, you know, put that on record. And there were no bullies. There was no abuse of the sort that you hear of at other schools. You know, some of them were a bit dull or old-fashioned, a bit mean-spirited, but there were no monsters. I have to say that. And the other things I enjoyed about school was, I suppose, the friendships, the camaraderie, you know, the secret skivings off to the pub or to the fields to smoke players number 6. There were school dances. There were raucous teenage parties at the homes of day boys in the area. We used to sneak off to the Guildford Civic Hall to watch Genesis or Roxy Music or the Groundhogs, you know. So within the limits of the boarding school parameters, you know, there was a lot of fun to be had. And I wanted to just read a poem which set in the dormitory, but it stars my best friend Rob Jones, who is a lovely guy. And I was very lucky for him to be my friend. He was very funny and kind, but he used to wind me up about Monday morning, which was my worst morning. I had double Latin, which was 80 minutes with a master called Neggers, who is very old school, very rigorous and strict, loved classics. And 80 minutes in a class of 2 where there was nowhere to hide, you know, it was just terrible. And so Rob used to, you know, wind me up about this wretched lesson. And this poem tells what happened one winter morning in 1975. It's called Senior Dormitory, Monday Morning.
And I'd just like to say it's page 59 for those of you who are reading this, if you have a copy while James is reading.
Thank you, Piers. Senior Dormitory, Monday morning. It's icy. I'm snug in bed, aware that Jones is crouching down and whispering in my ear, suspiciously benign. You awake, James? You'll never guess. I've got you out of Latin. I've settled it with Neggers. You're in the clear. He knows how much I'm dying to believe him. I dread that class, and now he's seized his chance. Relax. I'll run your bath and get hot towels. I close my eyes. I'm gone, and he's relentless. But first I'll bring the croissants, cafe au lait, and then perhaps a fat hand-rolled gauloise. I dream of sky blue France or Saint-Tropez and float in heaven till I hear the bell and Jonesy's chuckle fading into hell.
Yeah, there's a poem earlier on about Jonesy, number 6, page 10. So yeah, it sounds like, and you talk about him at different instances in the book.
Yeah.
We use second row together as well.
That's right. Kind of, you know, twins really. He was, yeah. And his dad was an actor, and he had a sort of thespian side to him. And it was his idea that to make us appear more threatening in rugby, that we should speak with Welsh accents, because the Welsh team was very big in the 1970s, and he thought we'd scare the opposition by speaking with these ridiculous Welsh accents, which he could do, and I couldn't. But
brings a memory of me playing rugby on Cranley's pitches, actually,
really?
in the scrum. I was a centre. Was it a centre back? Was it? No, was it? Forgotten the name. Not fly half. I was a back, basically.
Inside
and there was
centre.
Outside centre. That's it.
Centre.
And there was an injury in the scrum, so I had to go into the scrum. And I remember thinking, God, this is terrible. I hate being in the scrum. Keep being
it's horrible.
And punched and that. But, so that brought a memory of, I remember playing on Cranley's pitches.
Yeah.
Doing that. So it was nicer being on the back, so you could just watch, and every now and again it's like, run.
Yeah.
Quick as possible. And then, okay, let's watch them.
Yes, I was very envious of the backs, that's for sure.
Yeah, and thank you for reading that. I think that's really powerful. I do love, by you reading, brings back memories of some of the friendships I had.
Oh, good. I'm glad you had some positive experiences.
I think for me, there were lots of positive. It was kind of the reframing of some of them. I think, had met some lovely people there. Some really benevolent and funny. The guy I shared a study with when I was 16.
Yeah. Called
Will. He was just so funny.
Yeah.
We used to talk late at night. Now we had a door. That was like for us, from 11 through till 16, we hadn't had any privacy. Suddenly you've got a door. It's like, yes, even though I'm sharing with someone else in a room, probably as small as this.
Oh, yeah.
And he's 6'1", and it's like, but it was like, yes, luxury.
Yeah.
So thank you. I really, yeah. So the next topic we've got is under pressure. And I'd love you to just talk a little bit about that, because you've got the exams.
Yeah. It's right. Well, I mean, at school, as you know, there were various types of pressure and many types of pressure. There were kind of deadlines almost every 40 minutes. Classes, dining hall, chapel, house room assemblies. It felt like we were in a kingdom of bells.
Mm-hmm.
And our bell had a particularly unpleasant timbre to it. It was like a huge electronic mosquito. It had a sort of zzz feel to it. And then there was, apart from deadlines, there was pressure from rules and regulations. I mean, just to give a silly example, I mean, for those who might be looking, who didn't go to boarding school, we had to make our beds with what were called hospital corners, where you had to tuck in the blanket in a certain way at the end of the bed. And if a prefect or the matron thought it hadn't been done properly, they would strip the bed, and you'd have to make the whole thing over again. So that was a sort of a micro pressure, if you like. But when you multiply those micro pressures by 50, say, plus all the deadlines, it adds up. And I think the advantage day boys had and have is that at 5 o'clock, they can just switch off to some extent and go home. But the main pressure for me was I was given a target of grades to get to university. And so I kind of got obsessed by having to get 2 A's and a B in my Latin, Greek, and divinity. And it got out of control. I got to the stage where I thought every waking moment I could be revising another Greek irregular verb or a Latin gerund. And it might just save me in the Greek unseen translation. And there's a kind of perverse logic to that, instead of having that cup of tea, why not just open that dictionary? Because it might just bump me up from a B to an A. And that became sort of hardwired. And without really realizing it, it was almost like a literary or an academic eating disorder. I didn't really realize it was happening. And I remember by this stage last year, I was sharing a study with Rob Jones, my mate, and he was working hard too. And he used to knock off at midnight. And he'd say, come on, James, better get off to bed. I say, no, I'll just do a wee bit more. And that used to turn into, up to 2 hours more until I was sort of really exhausted. Eventually, I had a breakdown, which manifested itself as glandular fever. And it actually happened on a squash court against Dulwich College, where I was, playing their number one, and I played him the year before and had won. So I thought, well, I'll probably do the same because I'd improved. But halfway through the match, I suddenly felt as if the world was moving, and I wasn't. And I just remember being taken off in a minibus back to school, and I just remember the doctor saying, you're going to have to go home, glandular fever. And I remember saying, I can't, sorry, sir, I can't do that. I've got exams to pass. So I'm not going home. And he said, I'm sorry, Sonny, you are. And I thought, oh my God, well, that's it. That's my life over. I'm going to miss a whole term. I'll never get the grades. Won't get into Cambridge. Life over. Didn't realize that there was, life beyond Oxbridge at that stage, because it had become a fixation. And it may be that the school was complicit in that. I said earlier that it was great kudos to get anyone into Oxbridge because it was so rare. But the pressure was self-imposed to a large extent, I think. And anyway, I'll read this poem. It's called The Active Voice, and it's quite short. It's a sonnet. And the scenario is me revising Greek in the early hours of the morning.
And it's page 78, that one.
And there are some Greek words in the poem, but it's all quite straightforward. And I wanted just to give a sense of that argument in my mind about, working and pressure. The active voice. The school is hushed, asleep. I'm wide awake. My lamp as bright as Artemis's moon. Above a sea of open books, all Greek. The voice is nagging me. You need an A. Revise another verb. I'm slowing down, but conjugate I work, ergasme, and do the aorist of phroneo, I think. Go on, one more. My yawns a silent bellow for help. The tenses are a labyrinth. Exams are closing in, but I will never close the gap of ignorance like Zeno's arrow. One more might make the difference. My eyes are pink with fear of failure. Don't go to bed. All right, just one. Fovin, fovume. Dread.
Thank you, James. I really hear a lot of pressure. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, that's what happened. And
I can really resonate with this fear of failure. And that was a big thing I left school with,
right.
was that fear of failure.
Yeah.
And I think for many years, it's only the last 5-10 years really got to grips with it, that I got a sense I was a failure, you know. And so as you say that, it's like, yeah, pushing myself. I remember as you're sharing about the glandular fever, I remember playing in the first 15 and I got, might have been Cranley we were playing, I can't remember, but it was at my school. I hit heads with this prop, big guy.
Yeah.
And I kind of collapsed on the floor. And I believed when you hit heads, you know, and someone said you've been knocked out, that would mean that you're totally gone. But I could still hear people. So I said, no, I can carry on. And they're like, no, you can't carry on. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to carry on. Can you see anything? I'm like, no, it's totally black, but I'm going to play on.
Dear me.
But that type of thing, that no, we'll be fine. Don't I'm not going home.
It's the making of you, Piers.
Yeah.
Carrying on. Yeah. God.
Yeah. So yeah, so I can really hear that there, that pushing. Don't go to bed. Keep going. One more. Can resonate. Yeah, as you read the poems, I really feel them. I think that's what I'm really getting as I'm reading the book. Yeah, I really feel them. I feel it very healing, just reading and hearing them for me.
Good.
Thank you.
Good job done.
Yeah. So I'm aware of time. We've been talking over an hour or so, probably an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of more topics that we were going to talk about. One was boarding school in the 70s, and the other was the feminine principle. So I'd love you to speak a little bit about those. Please,
okay.
James.
Yeah. Well, probably at all the eras, but particularly in the early 70s, maybe late 60s, I think boarding schools particularly schizoid, because on the one hand, you are living in a bubble of Victoriana with your short hair and your black and white uniforms, and with rules and regulations that go right back to Tom Brown. And yet you just step outside the gates, and for me, there was the 1970s. There were guys wearing caftans and purple-colored loons, and girls, tie-dyed T-shirts, and it was color, and it was just very strange. And I felt as if, it was such a different world. It was like the land of Oz was to Dorothy in Kansas, where she, I don't know if you know the film well, but she emerges from this sort of black and white world into the land of Oz, which is full of color and rainbows and so on. And it was like that for me. And we spent most of our terms trying to grow our hair as long as possible and tucking it behind the ears to give us a head start for the holidays, because we had it in our heads that, no girl would look at us unless we had long beatnik hair, go for the old heads instead. And I wanted to try and capture this schizoid experience in a poem where I used the imagery of Plato's parable about the prisoners in the cave. It's quite well known to people who've done Latin and Greek, this parable. And I won't tease out the parable itself, but you'll sort of get the idea. But it's, if you can imagine prisoners in a cave, which is sort of analogous to how we were. The actual parable, which is well worth reading itself, it's a wonderful image of progression to spiritual truth, from moving from a cave to the entrance of the cave and to the light, you know. Anyway, I've called this Plato's Cave. In jackets of limestone tweed or navy blazers, stiff collared shirts and graphite trousers, we sat inside a cave, chained up to chairs. Our eyes were trained to stare at shadowy boards, on which a stream of ghostly words appeared and vanished, imprinting the real world. But then one time a boy broke free and crawled through darkness to the entrance and saw the 1970s, a giant disco dance of long-haired folk in pink crushed velvet loons, embroidered kaftans, bangles, platform shoes, and t-shirts dyed with cosmic swirls of turquoise. When he returned, he gabbled on and craved the world he said he'd seen beyond the cave, where people kissed and dressed in rainbow light. But all we knew was grey or black and white. They chained him up again. We shut our eyes and blocked our ears and let our teens slip by.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. It's like that separation, different worlds.
Yeah, what was it like in the 80s and at your school? Did you have that same sort of?
Yeah, well, I was listening to someone involved with this organization called Menfest, and we were talking about the 80s more from a racial divide, and someone was saying just what it was like in the 80s with the skinheads and the violence, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I really saw that. Because yeah, I mean, I felt this, I didn't really fit in at home. There wasn't much, didn't have friends there, so I didn't really go out, not until a bit probably the 90s. So yeah, the 80s, yeah, same thing, just felt like a different world. Like you say, when we had, the hospital was there, the food was there, everything you needed was there at the school. So why would you need to go out? You know, but from those who would go out and buy a drink and then bring that into the school, even that, you know, they would bring it to you. You didn't need to go out for it. So yes, there was that separation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
Interesting that. But all we knew was grey or black and white.
Yeah, it was, I think looking back, I didn't realize that we were actually deprived of colour, you know, actually. The brightest colours in the school were the house ties. Each house had a different sort of colour, and if you were especially talented or a prefect, you had a tie with the colour of your tie, of your house on it.
Okay.
And it really stood out, you know, the green or the yellow or the crimson. And you could see someone wearing a house tie a mile away. It was just so, otherwise so uniformly grey. You know, it's like living in the 1950s, you know. Every weekday was like a Sunday in the 1950s. And so, yeah, it was just totally schizoid. And going on Exeat, you know, for a weekend, it was just, you know, it took first few hours, just the shock of colour. I remember looking at a Belisha beacon and thinking, wow, you know, it's like being in a disco, but you're just being driven home. And they, and you saw, pubs with, flowers outside, and oh, it's amazing. And going back to my bedroom, which had, football posters, West Ham football posters on the wall, and it was just so colourful. In fact, someone who read my book and who read the poem I've just read said it reminded her of the time when Britain got colour TV for the first time, which was in the late 60s.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a big moment. I remember it. I think my mum got a colour TV for Wimbledon, and you were used to these black and white grainy, TVs, and then suddenly she switched it on, and there was Wimbledon, green and colour, and that's what the 1970s were like in comparison with school. But you mentioned, I suppose, related to this, about the feminine, the lack of the feminine in school, and I think we differ here because yours was co-ed, wasn't it, more or less?
It was, yeah. So when I was there, the girls had arrived, I think, in 84. So I got there 86. So they were just new. And I think possibly there were 2 full houses with girls in. So there was 8 houses in total. So that meant 200 girls, 600 boys. Now it's 400 girls, 400 boys. So there's now equaled it up. Interestingly, I've been back in touch with one of the girls, and I didn't have that much connection with them. I was very shy, but she was saying to me that there was a lack of feminine for them as well, being girls there, because it was in a masculine environment. It was like it was frowned upon to put makeup on and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
To look feminine.
Yeah.
And although girls were there the first couple of years, as the boarding school itself was an island into itself, the boarding houses were islands into themselves. First couple of years, we weren't really allowed out of the boarding house apart from for lessons or sport.
Yeah.
Maybe half an hour you could go and visit someone if you were really brave. So I almost didn't see the girls really that much. Or if you did, it was like I didn't speak to them. So there was a lack of feminine. It was like this mythical creature. It was like, oh, what do you do with them? Can you speak to them?
Yeah, what do you do with them? Yeah, that's about how it was. Mythical creature as well. Yeah, that's certainly the case with us. Well, we didn't have girls at all really until last year, and I think again we took it for granted. But this monoculture of masculinity, and it was like sort of the atmosphere was like a radioactive fallout of testosterone. And I think definitely at a conscious level and an unconscious level, there was a craving for the feminine, or the feminine principle. On the one hand, for mothering, and on the other hand, for romantic love. But also I think for those qualities traditionally associated with the feminine, i.e., things like sensitivity, feelings, kindness, gentleness, and things that you didn't admit to, not readily. I mean, it wasn't unheard of. We had some sensitive masters who would, talk about Keats and Shakespeare in a sensitive way, and we were allowed to sort of, be a bit gooey, but not too much, But it did mean that any female on the premises who was anyway attractive got a huge amount of attention, like a housemaster's wife, for example. But eventually girls did join the school in my last 2 years, but there were only about 12 of them. And it was, once the novelty wore off for them of having 27 boyfriends each, 27 admirers, shall we say. You know, it was very difficult for them because they were just stared at all day, you know, and just, you know, they'd open their study, and there'd be sort of three boys that lie across the floor, you know, waiting for them to step over them. You know, it was ridiculous. But I suppose in conjunction with this, I'd like to end this particular session, or the end of the poems anyway, with a poem. It's a jokey poem, actually, but nevertheless, it gives an idea of our relationship with the feminine and our lack of knowledge and experience with girls as 13-year-olds. And it stars Neggers, the classics teacher whom I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And it's called Sex Education Terra Incognita, which is Latin for unknown land. Yes, I recall de bello Gallico. The morning we were parsing scutum hasta, then vagina. Someone sniggered. So, you find that funny? Neggers hissed. What word do we derive from vagina? Our heads plummeted so fast they nearly hit our desks. He picked on some poor joker who muttered, vagina, sir. Correct. Who can tell me what it is? No one spoke. For unlike Gaul, girl was still terra incognita. Do I really have to tell you? He chalked up what we longed to know, and there, revealed at last, the mystery of woman. Noun, singular, feminine, first declension.
Was that really the sex education
that was
at your
true
school?
True story. That,
oh,
yes,
wow.
that was sex education.
Oh my Lord! Wow, wow. I don't even think we had sex education. I know we had biology. We talked about genitals and we had pictures of, you know.
Yeah.
But that, you know, but I don't remember. I might be wrong. I'm sure I would remember that. But we had sex education from the 12-year-olds telling us all these rude words and asking us, quizzing us. It was called an innocence test. And they would say, what's this? What's a 69? And you're like, no idea. And they're like, it's this. And you're like, you failed. And it's like, what? So that was our sex education from a 12-year-old about what sex was. It sounded a bit brutal, I have to say.
Yeah, well, actually, we did have an official, that was an unofficial sex education. We had an official one where this poor, actually I have a poem about it, about this poor, I think she was a retired nurse who came in, and she said, you know, you can ask me any question you want about sex, you know. Of course, there was a dead silence because no one wanted to admit to ignorance about sex. So she made us write down questions on paper so we wouldn't be embarrassed, and she put them in a pot. We were 13 years of age, and she picked out the first question, and she said, "Don't worry, I cannot be embarrassed." And she read it out, and it said, "Please, miss, can we see your tits?" And she blushed pink. So that, yeah, well, that kind of, tells its own story about 13-year-old boys and
repression.
yeah,
Suppression of that feminine. And
yeah,
I like what you say about it being as much about the internal qualities of kindness, gentleness, sensitivity that were not accepted either.
well, not in public anyway. There were a lot of sensitive and kind acts which I witnessed, but mostly in private. You wouldn't do it in class really. And it was a very. I was saying to someone the other day that in the French class, if you try to put on a French accent, people will mock you.
Mm-hmm.
They go, ooh, as if you're showing off. So anything that smacked of being sort of, I don't know, refined or sensitive, you had to be, well, let's say you had to be careful at the very least. And I think that was probably quite shaping. I still go, woo, if I hear someone do a French accent.
Interesting. Yeah. I think I had that in a report, my housemaster saying he's very self-effacing or something like that, he doesn't shine his light. It's
Yeah.
very, it was very much, that thing you don't put your head above the parapet type thing.
How did you survive then, Piers? If you were kind of shy and sensitive, as I take you to have been, if my strategy was to do Latin, Greek, and divinity and play squash, how did you cope?
Not very well, to be honest. I was suicidal for a time.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. I was,
but because of that, you mean? Because of, or for other things?
Well, I was sporty.
Right.
And when I was 13, I injured my back playing cricket. I was a fast bowler. I hurt it. So for a year, I was off sport. And I just ended up reading horror novels on my bed. And that, as you can imagine, is not great therapy for a 13, 14-year-old boy. And no one suggested or did anything else. So, I won't go into the stories now because it was deeply traumatic time around that, which I talk about in more distance in my book. But how I dealt with it was shutting down, just hating myself.
Right.
So I see that, and they talk about it. And I think one of your poems, you talk about putting this iron shirt on. And quite a lot of the boarding school authors talk about this idea of the shell. And I got a sense in my 20s that I had an exoskeleton around me, like an armor. And that's what I think I did to protect myself, was just to put an armor up of, this silent, passive aggressive, this silent. Then my nickname as a 17-year-old was Silent but Violent.
Oh.
Because I was very good at sport. But to get the younger boys to do stuff, I was a house prefect. I would jump on them because it's like, go to bed. But they, came across as very aggressive. So that's was my defense, was just stay away from me, a bit psychopath.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So that was and another way was just not to speak, James.
Yeah.
I went through a phase when I just didn't talk, because I found if I did talk, because I was very shy, people would pick my words apart.
I see.
And I'd just get angry. And when I went angry, I could think even less. So it was like, that was another way I dealt with it.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed our conversation. I found it beautiful. The poems have really touched me, and hearing you speak them, just feeling them in my heart. So thank you.
Well,
So
thank you, Piers. You're a great audience of one.
I
wish I could take you to poetry readings. You're like Negus. Oh my God.
He was the other audience of one. No, I've really enjoyed hearing them because it's like feeling them. That for me, as you read, it's like, oh yeah, the payphone or the friends. It's like, and I feel this. What Joy Chevron talks about, this idea, the importance of grieving or feeling, you know, and letting that go, rather than it staying inside, then letting it flow. So as you read, it's felt very healing and cathartic. So thank you.
Oh, I'm delighted, Piers.
Thank you.
That was the aim of the book, really.
So I will put into the description how people get hold of this. Is there a place which you would prefer people to go to? Because obviously I presume they can get it on Amazon. Well, that's where I bought mine.
It'd be nice to support the wonderful publisher, Two Rivers Press, who are based in Reading. And they have a dedicated site with buying option, which and they make a tiny bit more. Well, actually, they make more money from selling it direct than Amazon, who take a horrendous cut.
Oh.
Amazon are real. There's sort of the Tesco's of the book business. They sort of hoover up all the goods, and they put small businesses out of. You may have to cut this bit out.
No, that's fine. I think it's useful for people to hear.
Everyone knows how Amazon work. But anyway, the Two Rivers Press, who are a wonderful publisher, small and dedicated, and they make a wee bit more money if you buy direct, and it's the same price, I think, more or less.
Wow.
So thank you. Yeah, I'll give you the link or any other link, which be handy. Yeah.
Great. And do you have a website as well? They can
visit? Yeah. Not that it would be of great interest to boarding school syndrome aficionados, because I actually write my poetry tends to be spiritual and mystical and mythical.
I love that type of thing. So yeah.
Well, you might like it, but I know a lot of people who don't, because I'm not a best-selling author. But yes, I have a website which is just my name, jamesharper.com. So I can give you that as well, maybe after we've signed off.
Thank you. Okay, I'll put that in. And yeah, really beautiful. It's been lovely to speak to you. Thank you for your time today. And yeah, please do everyone go and buy a copy of this from Two Rivers Press, because it's a really beautiful a piece of work. So,
well, thank you, Piers, and I'd just like to thank you for inviting me on your podcast, and to recommend everyone to. I've had fantastic. It's been fascinating and thought-provoking to see your other podcasts. With I've seen about 4 or 5, and each of them is a gem of its own. And so I recommend anyone who happens to be seeing this to see your back catalogue. And you're doing very fine work.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate your support. Okay. Take care. Be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.